A lonely millionaire believed he had conquered everything, until a simple gesture from his housekeeper completely changed his life. What began with a cup of coffee transformed into revealed secrets, unexpected encounters, and the discovery of a love capable of breaking down all barriers. Get ready, because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video and comment where you're watching from. There are treasures hidden in the lives we barely notice, waiting for someone to see them. In a city where skyscrapers competed for space in the sky, there were two worlds that existed in parallel, rarely touching beyond practical necessities. At the top of one of these glass buildings, a man woke up feeling an inexplicable emptiness. Charles Henry Morrison, 47, owner of an investment empire, was used to having everything money could buy. His triplex penthouse was a monument to success. Original works of art, Italian furniture, a panoramic view of the city that so many envied. But on that specific morning, as he observed the impeccably arranged breakfast table, imported fruits, aligned on fine porcelain, freshly squeezed juice in Venetian crystal, artisan bread still warm, something seemed different. Not in his surroundings, which remained as perfect as always, but within him. A persistent discomfort, as if something essential was missing from his meticulously planned life. The morning sun crossed through the immense windows, creating golden patterns on the marble floor, while Charles sat alone at that table too big for one man. Loneliness wasn't a new sensation. Since the divorce 3 years ago, he had grown accustomed to the silence that echoed through the 6,000 square feet of his residence. But today, that silence seemed almost oppressive. It was then he noticed, for the first time truly, the woman who quietly cleaned the other side of the room. Emily Thompson, the housekeeper who for 5 years had entered and left his house like a shadow, efficient and discreet. He knew her name only because it was in the contracts, on the payroll. But who was she really? What life did she lead when she left those doors? Charles realized he had never wondered. The discomfort grew, becoming almost physical. There was an entire world beyond those glass walls, beyond the numbers on his screen, beyond business meetings and dinners with partners. A world he had forgotten how to observe. Emily moved through the apartment with discreet grace, as if trying to occupy the smallest possible space in her employer's universe. She was about 40 years old, black hair always tied in a simple bun, rough hands of someone who had worked since early, and a look, Charles noticed for the first time, that carried untold stories. Despite the evident fatigue in her posture, there was a silent dignity in her that suddenly intrigued him deeply. "Emily," he called, breaking years of silence beyond the strictly necessary. She stopped, surprised by the unusual call, and turned slowly. "Yes, sir? Would you like a cup of coffee?" Her eyes widened momentarily, revealing confusion at that unexpected gesture. "You don't need to trouble yourself, sir. It's no trouble at all." Charles got up and poured a cup for her. When he extended the fine porcelain in her direction, he noticed how Emily held the cup carefully, almost with reverence, as if she didn't deserve to touch something so valuable. It was a small gesture, but one that suddenly awakened in him an overwhelming curiosity about life beyond that apartment. In that moment, something changed inside Charles. An impulse he couldn't explain took hold of him. He needed to know more about that woman who, day after day, cared for his most intimate space, and yet remained a complete stranger. He would cancel all appointments for that day. For the first time in years, the numbers could wait. What Charles didn't know is that this simple decision would forever change the course of two lives that, until then, only orbited each other without ever truly touching. Charles observed Emily work for a few minutes, noticing details he had never perceived before. The way she limped slightly from her right leg, the tired sigh she let escape when she thought no one was listening, the red hands from chemicals that cleaned his immaculate surfaces. Who was this woman who entered his house every day and whom he would barely recognize on the street? "Emily, do you live far from here?" he asked suddenly, making her stop again. "In the East End, sir." "Whitechapel," she answered without going into details, visibly uncomfortable with the unexpected attention. "It must be a long journey to here." "Almost 2 hours, sir, but I'm used to it." 2 hours. 4 hours a day on public transport. Charles tried to imagine what it would be like to face that daily, but his mind, accustomed to private drivers and constant comfort, couldn't form a clear image. He knew Emily had children, or were they nieces and nephews? He wasn't sure. He only knew the basics, superficial information that appeared on her file. He didn't know anything about her difficulties, her dreams, her daily struggles. This realization bothered him deeply, as if he had suddenly discovered a serious flaw in his character. After Emily left to clean another room, Charles went to his office. He opened the drawer where he kept old documents and found the domestic staff folder. Her address was there, along with basic information: 2 dependents, incomplete high school, widow. He looked at that paper and felt a strange determination grow within him. Without thinking much about what he was doing, Charles took the keys to his car, not the silver Porsche he used to impress clients, but the more discreet BMW he rarely drove. He canceled all the day's meetings with a quick message to his secretary, ignoring the several callback attempts she made afterward. As he drove out of the luxury condominium, he felt like an explorer about to discover unknown territory. The GPS showed a route he had never traveled, leading him to zones of the city that, until then, were just indistinct spots seen from afar, from the height of his apartment or a helicopter window. The landscape gradually changed. The mirrored buildings were left behind, giving way to simpler constructions, then row houses, popular shops, narrower streets. The impeccable asphalt gave way to potholed roads. Luxury cars were replaced by economy models, motorcycles, crowded buses. Charles felt as if he was entering another city, another reality. The further he got from the center, the more the city showed its scars: broken sidewalks, tilted posts, improvised wiring that formed chaotic webs over the streets. Children played in unmaintained squares. Elderly ladies chatted in chairs on sidewalks. Young people gathered at small local shops. It was a pulsing life, a vibrant community he had never really seen or considered. After almost an hour driving, following the GPS's mechanical instructions, Charles finally arrived at the indicated street. The houses there were small, many unfinished, some with exposed brick. Old cars parked, clothes hung on improvised clotheslines, loud music coming from some nearby residence. The GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." Charles parked in front of a simple house with low walls. The light blue paint was peeling, revealing patches of gray cement underneath. The small iron gate was just pushed closed, as if there was nothing valuable to protect inside, or as if there was no time for repairs. Compared to its neighbors, it was a modest property, but clean and organized, reflecting something of Emily's personality he was beginning to perceive. For a moment, Charles hesitated. What was he doing there? What right did he have to invade the private life of an employee? He was overcome by a wave of doubt and was about to start the car again when he heard a weak cough from inside the house, followed by a child's voice. Something in those sounds impelled him to continue. He took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked to the gate. His heart beat fast, as if he was about to do something forbidden. He knocked gently on the simple wooden door and waited, feeling increasingly out of place in his Italian suit and polished leather shoes. The door opened slowly. Emily appeared wearing simple clothes, so different from the uniform he always saw her in. For an instant, he almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in dark waves. In her hands, a damp dish towel betrayed that she had been interrupted in some domestic task. The shock on her face was immediate and absolute. Her eyes widened, and her mouth opened in a small O of surprise. It was as if a fictional character had suddenly stepped out of television and appeared at her door. "Mr. Morrison?" Her voice came out almost as a whisper. Before Charles could answer, a muffled sound came from inside the house. A frail voice called, "Em, who is it, my dear?" It was then that Charles looked beyond Emily and saw what his curiosity had discovered. In the small living room, poorly lit by a narrow window, there was an improvised hospital bed. In it, an elderly and extremely thin lady breathed with difficulty through an oxygen mask connected to a cylinder beside the bed. Her white and sparse hair framed a face marked by time and illness, but which still kept traces of Emily. Beside that bed, a middle-aged man sat in a wheelchair. His hands were twisted by arthritis or some degenerative disease, and his gaze seemed distant, as if part of him was no longer there. A thin blanket covered his motionless legs. On the living room floor, sitting on a worn carpet, 2 children played quietly with pieces of colored paper. A girl of approximately 6 years old, with curly hair tied in simple braids, and an older boy, maybe 10 years old, with serious and attentive eyes that immediately fixed on the stranger at the door. The impact of that scene was like a punch to Charles's stomach. It was as if all the weight of the world was concentrated in those few square meters. Emily's reality, raw and exposed, was infinitely more complex and painful than he could ever have imagined. Emily, perceiving her employer's astonished gaze, instinctively moved to try to block the view of the room, a protective and, at the same time, embarrassed gesture. "Sorry for the mess, sir," she murmured, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I wasn't expecting visitors." It was a phrase so absurdly inadequate for the situation that Charles almost felt like laughing, not from humor, but from the absurd. There was no mess there, just life in its rawest and most challenging form. "No, I apologize for showing up." "Without warning," Charles replied, finding his own voice with difficulty. I just wanted..." But what did he want exactly? He himself didn't know how to explain the impulse that had brought him there. The little girl, curious like all children, approached the door. She looked at Charles with big and innocent eyes, and then smiled timidly, revealing the absence of a front tooth. "Are you a friend of Aunt Em?" she asked with a sweet voice. The simple question hit Charles like an arrow. Friend? No, he wasn't Emily's friend. He was just the man who paid for her to clean his house, who barely noticed her presence, who had never cared to know her life until that moment. "Lucy, don't bother the gentleman," Emily said softly to the girl, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. Then, turning to Charles, "They're my nieces and nephew. They've been with me for 3 years since my brother and sister-in-law." She didn't complete the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. The presence of the children, the tone of her voice, told the tragic story that hung in the air. "Please, come in," Emily finally offered, stepping away from the door. There was no way to refuse now. Charles took a few hesitant steps into the house, feeling like an intruder in a world that wasn't his. The interior was small, but meticulously, clean and organized, reflecting the same efficiency Emily demonstrated in her work. Simple furniture, some visibly used, was arranged to maximize the limited space. On the walls, some family photos in cheap frames. In a corner, school books and notebooks carefully stacked. "This is my mother, Mrs. Grace," Emily indicated the lady in the bed, who observed the visitor with eyes clouded by age but still attentive. "And my father, Mr. Robert." The man in the wheelchair made a vague movement with his head, a silent greeting. His eyes, though opaque, seemed to assess the rich visitor with a dignity that transcended his physical condition. "And these are Lucy and Peter, my niece and nephew." The older boy remained distant, watching with suspicious eyes. But little Lucy approached again, fascinated by the elegant stranger who had entered her house. Emily offered the only decent armchair in the room, an old but well-maintained piece of furniture. "Please, sit down," Charles obeyed, still stunned by the reality unfolding before him. The distance between his world and Emily's seemed not just geographical but almost cosmic. How could two people live in the same city, breathe the same air, and exist in such drastically different realities? "Would you like some coffee, sir?" Emily offered, already heading to the small adjoining kitchen, visible through a door without a latch. "Yes, thank you," Charles replied automatically, still trying to process everything he saw. While Emily prepared coffee in the improvised kitchen, little Lucy approached him, holding a drawing made on a piece of recycled paper. "Look, I made a castle," she said with childish pride, showing the colorful drawing. Charles took the paper carefully, as if it were a precious object. "It's a very beautiful castle," he said sincerely, noticing the child's effort in the simple details. "Aunt Em said that one day she'll take me to see a real castle," Lucy continued, her eyes shining with the innocence of one who still believed in all promises. Charles felt a knot in his throat. He had already visited castles in Europe, palaces. In the Orient, architectural wonders around the world. Trips that for him were just passing diversions, items crossed off a list of easily achievable desires. For this girl, however, seeing a castle was a distant dream, a promise for someday that might never come. Emily returned with a simple cup, one of those bought in supermarket promotions. The coffee steamed, fragrant and strong, served with care, that seemed reserved for special occasions or important visits. "Sorry, we don't have refined sugar, only brown," she said, placing a small pot beside the cup. "It's perfect like this," Charles replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was surprisingly good, strong and aromatic, so different from the gourmet coffee served in his penthouse, but somehow more authentic, more real. An embarrassing silence hung over them. Emily remained standing, as if ready to attend to any need, unable to sit in the presence of her employer even in her own home. "Please sit down," Charles asked, indicating the small sofa beside him. Reluctantly, Emily obeyed, sitting on the edge of the sofa, hands crossed in her lap, in a posture that revealed the discomfort of the unusual situation. "Emily," Charles began, not knowing exactly how to formulate what he wanted to say, "I realize today that I've worked with you for 5 years and know practically nothing about your life." She looked at him surprised, as if the idea that he should know something about her was completely strange. "There's not much to know, sir," she replied with simplicity. But there, in that small and cramped room, Charles clearly saw that there were entire worlds to know, stories of struggle, sacrifice, love and resilience that he had never considered. "Your mother, has she been ill for long?" he asked, looking at the elderly lady who now seemed to have fallen asleep with the oxygen mask. 3 years. She had a severe stroke, lost movement on her left side, and has breathing problems. Emily spoke with an objectivity that seemed rehearsed, like someone who had repeated the same story many times to doctors, social workers, and other authorities. "My father developed Parkinson's 5 years ago, and the disease advanced quickly. He can barely do anything alone anymore." Charles noticed there was no lament in her voice, just the statement of facts she had accepted as an inevitable part of life. "And the children?" Emily cast a quick glance at her niece and nephew, who now played quietly in a corner. Her expression softened. "My brother and his wife died in a motorcycle accident 3 years ago. It was just the two of them and the children. There was no one else to care for them, so..." She shrugged, as if taking responsibility for 2 orphaned children was the most natural thing in the world. "3 years ago you were already working for me," Charles reflected, realizing this drama had happened without him even noticing any change in her behavior. "I never imagined you were going through all this." "You couldn't have known, sir," she replied diplomatically. "We all have our problems, but Charles's problems, deciding which island to spend vacation on, which new car to buy, which restaurant to choose for a business dinner, seemed ridiculously trivial compared to what Emily faced daily. How do you manage? Taking care of all of them and still working? "There's always a way," she replied with a simplicity that carried more wisdom than any complex philosophy Charles had ever studied. "We get up every day and do what needs to be done." The phrase, so simple and direct, struck Charles deeply. He, with all his resources, his elite university education, his expensive leadership training, had never synthesized life's purpose so clearly and essentially. "And do you have help? Any relatives, friends, neighbors?" "The neighbors are good. They help when they can. But everyone here has their own struggle," she explained. "There's a lady from the church who comes to stay with my parents when I need to go out. The children go to public school nearby. On weekends, a niece of my sister-in-law sometimes takes the children to spend the day." Charles noticed how Emily organized her life in a complex system of mutual support and small favors, an economy of solidarity that he, accustomed to simply paying for services, could barely understand. The afternoon advanced, and the light began to change, creating elongated shadows in the small room. From somewhere came the sound of a boiling pot. "Excuse me, sir. I need to check dinner." Emily got up, heading to the kitchen. Charles was left alone in the room, observing details he hadn't noticed before. On the wall, a free pharmacy calendar marked medical appointments and school commitments. On a small table, medicine bottles were organized with homemade labels. Beside the improvised hospital bed, an old and much-handled Bible. Through the kitchen window, he could see Emily moving with the same efficiency she demonstrated in his apartment, but now in an infinitely more limited space. She checked a pot on the simple stove, stirred something in another, checked the rice. Her movements were precise, economical, without waste of energy. Little Peter cautiously approached Charles. "Are you Aunt Em's boss?" he asked with children's direct frankness. "Yes," Charles replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the term boss. "Does she work hard at your house?" the boy continued, his serious eyes evaluating the visitor. "Yes, she works very well," Charles replied, realizing how inadequate this response sounded. Peter seemed to ponder for a moment, then said with wisdom beyond his age, "Aunt Em works too much. Sometimes she comes home so tired she falls asleep, sitting on the sofa." The child's simple observation was like a silent accusation. Charles imagined Emily returning home after hours cleaning his immense apartment, facing 2 hours of crowded public transport, only to begin her second, or would it be third, shift caring for sick parents and children. In that moment, the enormity of the world's injustice hit him like never before. Not an abstract, distant, theoretical injustice, but a concrete one, personified in the woman who now prepared simple dinner in the adjacent kitchen, the same woman who cleaned the dust from his expensive objects without ever complaining. Emily returned to the room. "Dinner will be ready soon. Would you like to stay?" The invitation was made with hesitation, as if she were conscious of the modesty of the meal she could offer, but also driven by hospitality that seemed to be in her DNA. Charles looked at his watch. It was almost 6 in the evening. Under normal circumstances, he would now be at some expensive restaurant with clients or partners, discussing millions while tasting rare wines. "I would love to stay, but I don't want to be a bother," he replied sincerely. "It's no bother at all." Emily repeated the same phrase he had used earlier, with a small smile that illuminated her tired face. It was thus that Charles Henry Morrison, owner of one of the country's largest investment companies, found himself sitting at the simple formica table in his domestic employee's house, sharing a dinner of rice, beans, a small portion of ground beef stretched with vegetables, and salad from the neighborhood community garden. Little Lucy insisted on sitting next to the visitor, bombarding him with childish questions about his house. "Is it true there's a pool inside? And his cars? Do you have one that flies?" Peter remained reserved, but Charles noticed how his eyes observed everything, recording every detail. Dinner was served on simple plates, with utensils from different sets, recycled cream cheese jars as glasses. Emily served everyone carefully. First the parents, helping her father eat, checking if her mother was comfortable. Then the children, making sure they ate their vegetables. Lastly, herself, with a smaller portion than the others. The food was simple, but tasty. Charles realized he hadn't eaten homemade beans in years, since his former cook had retired. The flavor brought memories of his own childhood, before the financial empire, before offshore accounts, before the gradual distancing from his own roots. While they ate, Charles began to hear more about Emily's life, how she had started working at 14 as a helper at a school, then as a server in an office, later as an elderly caregiver, how she had abandoned high school in the second year because she needed to work full-time when her father began to get sick, how she dreamed of one day finishing her studies and maybe taking a technical nursing course, a dream that seemed increasingly distant given the accumulating responsibilities. There was no self-pity in her narrative. She told her story like someone reporting objective facts, without judgment or resentment. For Emily, that was simply life, difficult sometimes, but hers. And she faced it with a dignity Charles had never witnessed in his circles of wealthy friends, where small inconveniences were treated as great tragedies. At the end of the meal, Charles offered to help with the dishes, a gesture that made Emily smile with surprise. "You've never washed dishes in your life, have you?" Charles laughed, recognizing the truth in the observation. "I think not since adolescence, when my mother occasionally insisted. Then you don't need to start now," she replied gently. "It's getting late, and you have a long way back." Charles realized it was getting dark. The idea of leaving that house and returning to his luxurious and empty apartment suddenly saddened him. There was something there, in that cramped space full of challenges, that seemed more alive, more real, more meaningful than everything he had built. When saying goodbye, Charles felt an inexplicable impulse. He took his wallet from his pocket, ready to offer money, his automatic response to any problem. But something stopped him. Instinctively, he knew Emily would refuse. Not from foolish pride, but from genuine dignity. She hadn't told her story to inspire pity or to get financial help. She had simply answered his questions with honesty. Instead, he knelt to be at Lucy's height, who watched him with her big, curious eyes. "You know that castle you drew? Maybe we can visit a real one someday." The girl's face lit up. "Really, really? Really, really," Charles confirmed, feeling a strange emotion making that simple promise. As he left through the narrow door, Charles knew his life had changed. Not dramatically or instantly, like in movies, but deeply, at a level he couldn't yet fully understand. Driving back to the city center, he observed the lights turning on in the windows of thousands of simple houses. How many stories like Emily's existed there? How many silent struggles? How many anonymous heroes? How many lives of sacrifice and love happened every day without him ever having noticed? When he finally arrived at his luxury apartment, the glass walls and minimalist design that had once seemed so sophisticated now seemed cold and empty to him. He walked to the balcony and looked at the illuminated city below. Somewhere in that sea of lights, Emily was probably already in bed, exhausted after another long day, preparing to wake before dawn and start everything again. That night, for the first time in years, Charles Henry Morrison cried, not for himself, but for the beauty and pain of a world he had spent so long ignoring. In the following days, Charles watched Emily work with new eyes. He noticed the fatigue in her features, the purple marks on her arms from carrying too much weight, the methodical rhythm with which she performed each task, saving energy for the long journey she would still have ahead after leaving there. One morning, while she cleaned the living room windows, Charles approached. "Emily, I've been thinking, do you and the children need anything? Anything I can help with?" She stopped the movement of the cloth against the glass, turning to face him with a cautious expression. "You already help me a lot with the salary you pay," she replied diplomatically. "It's more than most offer." "I'm not talking as your employer," Charles gently insisted. "I'm talking as someone who cares." Emily lowered her gaze, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Her hands gripped the cleaning cloth as if seeking something to anchor herself. "I appreciate the concern, sir, but we don't need charity." The word charity hit Charles like a stone. That wasn't what he had in mind, but he now realized how his offer might sound, like a rich man feeling good about himself by helping someone less fortunate. "It's not charity," he replied carefully. "It's just humanity." She stared at him for a moment, her dark eyes evaluating the sincerity in his words. Finally, with an almost imperceptible sigh, she spoke. "My mother's medicines. Sometimes they're out of stock at the health center. And the physical therapy sessions Peter needs for his spine, the NHS only offers once a month." It was as if a floodgate had opened, allowing a small part of her difficulties to escape. Charles listened attentively, feeling simultaneously grateful for the trust and outraged by the difficulties she faced. "I can help with that," he said simply. "Please let me help." Emily hesitated, pride fighting against necessity. Finally, she nodded slightly, not with resignation, but with the same silent dignity Charles had witnessed in her home. "Thank you," she said, immediately returning to work, as if she needed to compensate for that brief moment of vulnerability. In the days that followed, Charles began appearing at Emily's house with increasing frequency. First, they were quick visits to deliver medicines or specific items he had promised. Then, he began staying longer, getting to know better the routine of that improvised family. On one of these visits, he brought a box of building blocks for the children. It wasn't the most expensive or technological of toys. He had quickly learned that ostentatious gifts caused more embarrassment than joy in that house. "Look, Aunt Em, I can build a castle now," exclaimed Lucy, opening the box with enthusiasm. Emily smiled, one of those rare smiles that illuminated her tired face and that Charles had begun to value as small treasures. Peter, initially resistant to the presence of his aunt's boss, began to lower his defenses. That night, for the first time, he approached Charles with a science book. "Do you know how volcanoes work?" he asked timidly. Charles spent the next hour sitting on the floor of the small room, explaining plate tectonics and magma to a boy whose eyes shone with scientific curiosity. Upon finishing, he realized Emily was watching them from the kitchen doorway, an indescribable expression on her face. "He wants to be a scientist," she commented later, while they washed dishes side by side, an activity Charles insisted on sharing, despite her initial protests. "He always asks about how things work. He's very intelligent," Charles replied sincerely. "He has potential to go far. If he has the opportunity," Emily added quietly, summarizing in a few words all the injustice of the system they lived in. The phrase kept echoing in Charles's mind long after he had returned home that night. If he has the opportunity. How many extraordinary talents did the world lose every day for lack of opportunities? How many Peters existed out there, brilliant and curious, destined never to develop their full potential because of circumstances beyond their control? The following week, Charles arrived with a discreet bag containing a used laptop, but in good condition, for Peter to research about science, he explained when Emily hesitated to accept. "And for you to take that online nursing course you mentioned." She looked at the equipment as if it were something from another world. "We don't have internet at home. It has a mobile data chip," Charles explained, having already anticipated this difficulty. "It works without needing a fixed connection." It was one of the rare moments when he saw Emily's eyes well up. She didn't thank verbally, just nodded, but her look said everything words couldn't express. As time passed, the relationship between them subtly changed. In the penthouse, Emily continued being the efficient employee as always, but there was a new awareness between them, a silent understanding. Charles began facilitating her work discreetly, organizing his own belongings, avoiding unnecessary messes, replacing harsh cleaning products with gentler versions for her hands. In return, at the simple house in Whitechapel, Charles gradually stopped being the boss to become simply Charles. The visits, previously justified by some practical need, became a natural part of the routine. A shared dinner on Thursdays, a Sunday afternoon helping Peter with homework, a walk to the public park with Lucy. His world, once limited to luxurious offices and starred restaurants, expanded to include the neighborhood market where he helped Emily carry groceries, the small health center room where he accompanied Mrs. Grace to appointments, the small community library where he took the children on Saturdays. The contrast between his two lives, that of the millionaire executive and that of friend to a simple family from the outskirts, was sometimes surreal. In the morning, he could be closing $1 million deal in a boardroom overlooking the city. In the afternoon, he would be sitting on the sidewalk in front of Emily's house, drinking coffee from chipped mugs and chatting with neighbors. However, life rarely allows transformations without resistance. The first sign of problems came from an unexpected source. Charles's ex-wife, Victoria, a socialite connected to the same elite circles he frequented, heard rumors about his strange visits to a peripheral neighborhood. Worried about possible scandals that could affect the family's reputation, and consequently the value of company shares she still owned, she confronted him during a business dinner. "Are you having an affair with your housekeeper?" she asked, directly, with the sharp frankness that had always characterized her. "That's what everyone's talking about." Charles was genuinely shocked by the insinuation. "What are you talking about? Emily is a friend. I'm just helping her family." Victoria's laugh was loaded with cynicism. "Charles, nobody believes a man like you is regularly visiting a cleaning lady out of friendship. Whatever your game is, you need to think about your public image." The conversation left a bitter taste that persisted for days. Not because of Victoria's opinion itself, but because of the reality she exposed, the impossibility, in society's eyes, of a genuine friendship crossing class barriers. It was as if there existed a social script everyone followed without question, determining who could care about whom. The difficulties didn't stop there. At school, Peter began facing provocations because of the visits from the rich boss to his house. Some parents even made malicious comments about Emily taking advantage of the situation. "Maybe it's better if you don't come for a few weeks," Emily reluctantly suggested after sharing these concerns. "People talk. Let them talk," Charles replied with a determination that surprised both of them. "We're not doing anything wrong." But the truth was that the world wasn't prepared to easily accept the dissolution of invisible barriers that separated people like them. Each visit was accompanied by curious looks, whispers, distorted interpretations. Even in the luxury building where he lived, Charles began noticing changes. Doormen who had once been cordial now watched him with poorly disguised curiosity. Neighbors asked apparently innocent questions about his new friendship. Some of his partners subtly questioned his emotional stability. On a particularly difficult afternoon, after a tense meeting with investors who had heard worrying rumors about his behavior, Charles automatically drove to Emily's house, seeking comfort in that space where people were real and connections genuine. He found her in the small backyard, hanging clothes on the line. The afternoon sun created a golden halo around her concentrated face. For a moment, Charles simply watched, admiring the simple grace of her movements, the quiet strength she emanated. Emily noticed his presence and smiled, that rare smile that had become more frequent in recent months. "Difficult day?" she asked, with the sharp perception of someone who knows suffering intimately. "How do you know?" "It's written on your face," she replied simply, continuing to hang white sheets that danced in the gentle breeze. Charles approached and, without saying anything, began helping her with the clothes. They worked side by side in silence for a few minutes, finding comfort in the simplicity of the shared task. "People don't understand," he finally said. "They can't comprehend why I come here." Emily hung the last piece and turned to him. Her eyes, always tired but now also wise and gentle, met his. "And why do you come?" The question, asked without any pretense, hit Charles at the center of his being. Why did he come? What was he seeking in that simple house, in that improvised family, in that strong woman who faced life with a dignity he had never found in his privileged world? "Because here I find something I never had," he replied with honesty that surprised himself. "Something real." Emily didn't respond immediately. Her gaze wandered over the small backyard, the clothes swaying on the line, the window where Mrs. Grace could be seen sleeping and the children doing homework at the table. Finally, her eyes returned to meet his. "We also found something we didn't have before," she said softly. "Hope." It was in that moment, between white sheets dancing in the wind and the golden afternoon sun, that Charles understood. He wasn't there out of pity or guilt, or some strange type of charity. He was there because he had found a family, because he had found Emily. With an impulse that came from the deepest part of his being, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost hesitant, loaded with unformulated questions. For an instant, she reciprocated, her lips touching his with the same gentleness. Then, as if awakening from a dream, Emily pulled away. Her eyes revealed a whirlwind of